Hello and welcome back, lovely people, to part 2 of this watercolor tutorial. We are going to begin layering colors on the flower portion of this painting today. If you want, you can always mask out the bee beforehand, but I like living dangerously, so I'm going to skip that step today. But you can always do that if you want to. It can help keep things a little bit neater. We will be starting with quinacridone coral, opera pink, permanent violet, and Payne's gray for our watercolor paints. All the rest of our supplies are going to be the same as in part 1, so go ahead and start again with your cat's tongue from last time. Get that nice and wet, and let's create a nice pink wash for the back of our flower. Now again, I'm planning on speeding up some of these redundant portions. If you need to pause this video at any time, please do so that you can catch up. I am just trying to keep the length of these videos as short as possible. But as usual, I am going to be following my typical rule of creating a light, medium, and dark to begin our flower with. This pink I felt like was just a little bit too bright, so I added in a little bit of that purple to dull it down just a smidge. Then for our medium, we just have pure coral, and the dark is going to be pure violet. I ended up not using this last mix though, so don't even worry about it. Okay, we're going to start by wetting down our flower with this large flat brush again. We're going to go in with some clean water and wet down the entire surface of the petals. Also, don't forget to pick up a copy of my new book, link in the description below. The outline for this painting is in it if you want to copy my exact outline along with many others, which I will also be doing tutorials for. So yeah, pop on over there, and it really supports me if you would like to check that out. Thank you. Alright, so just go ahead and wet that down as thoroughly as you can, as quickly as you can, so we have a nice even layer of moist paper. Again, what you're looking for is glossy but not swimming. A good rule of thumb is that you want the entire surface that you will be painting to be shiny and thoroughly soaked, but if you turn the paper upside down, there will be no runoff, no dripping, no spills. Just as you don't want any dry streaks. And again, I'm edging carefully around my bee. If you're comfortable with that, you can also do this. But there's also no reason not to go in and mask it out first with liquid Frisket. I literally didn't, just because I didn't feel like taking the time to let it dry. Depending on your brand, it can take quite a while to dry. So switching back to the cat's tongue, our first order of business is to block in the large areas of color, and for that I'm going to be using our pink mix that we made first, because pink is the predominant color in this flower. When choosing the first mixes to layer, you want to find one that is going to poke throughout your painting most consistently. Choose something that will blend with all the other colors, both the shadows and the highlights if possible, and something to harmonize any other colors you may be adding. So this was a pretty easy choice. It is a very pink flower. Other things may be a little bit less obvious. Of course, practice is the best agent to help you choose what color you're going to need in a particular situation. So continue to cover the surface of the flower with your pink. Allow it to blend around and fuzz out wherever it wants to go. Wherever there is water, the pink will flow. So you'll see I kind of left the middle of the flower dry. That's because it's going to end up being much brighter than the surrounding color. So I didn't want the pink to flow in there. We're going to keep that a little bit brighter. So that's why I didn't wet that down. And here I'm blending it out a little bit because I didn't quite take the water far enough. I could have left it alone, but that's just going to create a hard edge as the pink flows up against the border of the wet paper where it meets the dry. And I didn't want that. I want it to be as smooth as possible, so you can always go back in and add a little bit more water to the edge if it's just not cutting it for you. And from here I continue to go in with a damp brush. This is the 1/2-inch flat brush that we've been using before, and both blending and lifting out areas of color that might have gone a little too dark. This is why it's so important to go in with lighter layers than you think you need. I went in with a pretty bright layer of pink to start with, and I accidentally went in just a bit closer to the middle than I meant to. So that's why I'm lifting out some of this color. You can always go and make things darker if it's too light, but it's really a lot harder to make it brighter if it's accidentally gotten too dark. So if you're gonna err on the side of being too light because it's easier to fix. And I'm speeding through this portion because I made a mistake and put the red on the wrong portion of the petal. So we're going to lift that out with our handy dandy paper towel and then smooth it a bit with the previous pink color because I went and made a goof. But no hurries, no worries, no big deal. We can fix this. And now we can switch back to our flat brush and pick up the red mixture again and put it on the correct portion of the petal this time. And then just a little bit of a stripe between each petal where they overlap. Not quite as thick as those broad bands of color. And this hard edge is still bugging me, so I'm going in with a clean damp brush to kind of pull some of that color out a little bit. You always want to rinse your brush frequently when you're pulling color out, otherwise you're going to just start pushing it around. So rinse, repeat, and lift very gently. We don't want to hurt our paper. I'm also going to lift out just a bit more of that color with my paper towel. A paper towel will do the same thing as a damp paintbrush will, but a bit more strongly. So if you have more color to lift out than your paintbrush can handle, use the paper towel. Still using the flat brush, let's go in with some purple to define some shadow areas. You can always take off extra paint on your paper towel if you think your brush might be overcharged, as I've done here. And my focus to begin with are going to be the largest areas of shadow. You always want to sneak up on the details and go large to small, general to specific. There's no hurry to get into the details. And you're much likely to put them exactly where they ought to be if you start with the big things first. So sneaking my way down these wrinkled portions of the petals. You can see how my paints are already becoming much paler as they dry, and this is anticipated. This is fully expected. There will be many more layers to go before we quite reach our full potential of color. But that also allows us to make little minor adjustments along the way and kind of takes the pressure off of trying to get it correctly the first time, which is crazy. I'm adding more shadows to the outer edges along this side of the flower because I think we have more of a top-down light source on our flower, so that means the leading edge along the top of the flower will be a little bit brighter, and we can make the shadows here at the bottom a bit heavier to give us a little bit of depth. Go ahead and rinse your paintbrush when you're done with layer 1 of shadows. We're going to use the damp brush to slightly lift out some veins in each petal and some highlights. I'm using gentle pressure to create a little bit of that wrinkled texture. When I start to push the purple around, it can either be good to add more purple stripes, or you may want to rinse your brush to lift out some color. Smooth out any hard lines that may be happening where your background has begun to dry. Now I'm going to begin to prepare layer 2 by adding more of the quinacridone coral and opera pink to this red mix to darken it up just a smidge and give us an even brighter color for our second layer. Now as I'm painting this, I can see that that bright pigment is going to run right up against that hard edge I've been fighting from the beginning, so I'm going in again with the damp clean brush to basically lay out a red carpet for the new paint to come in and travel down really smoothly along that path instead of jutting up against that space where the wet paper meets the dry and making a whole big line where I don't want. So now that I've done that, I can continue going around the flower and brightening up these stripes. And by the way, it is completely possible to do this whole thing using a wet on dry method if you don't prefer the wet into wet. A lot of it is personal preference. The reason I have chosen to do a lot of this wet into wet is because I like the blendy shapes. When I lay down the color, I want them to fuzz out and blend with the colors next to each other. Otherwise, I would just have to go in with a damp brush and do that blending manually, which in some places I actually do here, such as this particular stripe, which has gotten a little bit dry. But having the paper wet first is just kind of a leg up in terms of blending. As you can see here with this stripe, the color isn't blending into the surrounding purple so much because it's beginning to dry, so I have to go back in and dampen some areas that I want to be a little bit more diffuse. No big deal. And now I'm going to use the same brush with the red mix to add in just a bit more detail with those folds and ridges by dropping in some stripes with that red. Clean off your brush. It's time to darken up that pink mix for layer 2 of that one, just like we did with the red, and apply it over the rest of the flower petal. Going back in with the cat's tongue, which is just damp, to blend out the bottom of that second shade. I'm not taking it as far down towards the center as I took the first layer, again to create that illusion of blending out into white. So I apply the paint with one brush, and then with the other I blend it out just a little bit. You may or may not have to add the second brush depending on how wet your paper is at this point. But mine is starting to get quite dry, so we're going to just lift out a little bit of that color and blend it with a tiny bit of water. And I am avoiding the red ribs at this point. They can blend into each other a little bit, and we want that, but I'm not going over the top of them as I did with the first layer, because I want to keep the purity of that bright red, which we've so painstakingly laid down already. And then I do the exact same process for the next couple petals, so that's why I'm speeding this up. It's the same thing. Go ahead and pause the video when you're ready. Here I'm taking the damp cat's tongue. It doesn't really matter which brush you use to lift out some highlights on those red bars. They should still be damp enough that it's not too difficult. Just use the edge of your paintbrush, whatever shape you use. And then from here I continue the rest of the way around the flower with that second layer of pink. Okay, lovely peoples, let's add some titanium white from Holbein. I prefer this over white gouache personally, and a 1/4 inch flat brush. I'm taking some of this paint to set aside and keep it a little bit cleaner. Our goal is to do some dry brush work by creating some texture in the middle of this flower and emphasizing those unique patterns radiating from the center. If your paint isn't flowing quite enough, you can add a little bit of water here. I want it to be pretty thick though, so I've added very little. Going from the inside out, alternating from the flat to the edge, depending on whether I want more of a broad stroke or a thin line. And I apologize for my big fat hand in the middle of the camera here, so you can't really see, but you can see the effect of it, so sorry guys. This is also going to help us brighten up some of these areas that I accidentally painted over with too much pink that I've been fighting with this particular painting. But I think it will be okay anyway. Of course, it's always ideal to preserve the white of your paper instead of painting over it. It's a much brighter result. But once in a while we make a goof, and I find that Titanium White by Holbein is so good at reclaiming whites. I feel like it's even better than gouache, and what I like about it is, unlike acrylic, it is in fact watercolor and reconstitutable. And since our background is drying and we're using a fairly dry mixture of paint, this is going to allow us to achieve these really stark patterns on the edges without them blending in too much or flowing too much. I want them to stay exactly where I put them. And continue to work your way all the way around the center of the flower. My hand is in front of most of this, so I'm just going to speed it up. But now we want to add just a bit of color to the inside of that flower because it's not precisely white. I'm going to be taking a little bit of yellow and a tiny bit of green and mixing those together to add just a bit of dimension and glow to the very center of our morning glory. Now let's make this a little bit more of a shadow color by adding a tiny bit of that Payne's Gray to our current mix to darken it and cool it down. A little bit of purple. And that will provide a nice shadow tone for the center of our flower. There's very little detail to add here. We don't want to make it too busy or it'll end up distracting from the bee. Instead, we want to keep that nice and bright and clean so that the bee has a nice bright background to show it off. From here, you're going to rinse off your paintbrush and switch back to your purple mix. It's time for round 2 on the shadow colors. Now this time, I'm checking to make sure my paper is dry because I don't want the shadows to be spreading as much as I did earlier in the painting. I want to create more texture and depth by allowing these stripes to stay pretty crisp. Although if you prefer to have a more blended look, that is absolutely fine as well. I'm switching back and forth between the edge of my paintbrush again to create the thin long lines and then blending them a little bit using the flat. It's kind of a dance on how many details you want to be crispy and how many you want blended out depending on where you want the eye to land on your painting. And that's kind of difficult to explain, not gonna lie, so I feel like the best teacher in that regard is practice and finding out what you like and what you don't like. But from here we just go ahead and keep darkening over those layers of shadow we already did. This is going to give our flower also a little bit of motion because you have that sense that the petals are wrinkling, possibly in the breeze, swinging around on the vine, receiving light and shadow from the surroundings. And I'm going to speed up this next bit again because we just continue working our way all the way around the flower, adding these shadow details. Blend where you will and leave it crispy where you will. It depends on where you want it to be more shadow and more textured. Now we're going to add another layer of red to those ribs, those stripes. I'm still using that 1/4 inch flat brush and reapplying the red. Again, my background is pretty dry at this point, not 100%, but pretty dry. But that's okay because I don't want it flowing too far. I do want to blend this end though. I don't like how it's just sitting there like a hard edge. So taking a damp brush, we're going to slightly blend out where it fades in towards the center of the flower. And although I don't want this fading out as a bloom, I am going to take some of that red out into the petal just so it looks like it's part of the petal and not sitting on top of it. And then repeat the same process for all the stripes, both the broad ones and the skinny ones, all the way around the flower. I'm speeding this up because it's the same thing 5 times basically. Now we're going to take that deepest, darkest mix from earlier and add the shadows along the edges of those red stripes. This is where the petals basically are folding in on each other. We're not going to use a ton of this. It's a very powerful color on a delicate flower, but some shadow is necessary for interest and depth. However, I don't particularly like this color, so I'm going to add a little bit more of that quinacridone coral to it to make it a bit warmer so it blends into the flower a little more believably. After adding a lot of the quinacridone coral to the super dark mix, I ended up not liking it, so I'm adding a bit more to my pink mix instead to see if I can try something better. Bit more coral, bit more purple. And yeah, that looks great. It blends in with the surrounding colors and looks far more believable than that really tragic shadow mix did. And I'm beginning to add some texture by radiating some of these shadows out from the middle stripe with the edge of my paintbrush. But you can always go in, as I do here, and blend them out just a little bit and soften those edges with just a second damp paintbrush. And as before, you're going to go around and repeat the same process to all of those stripes. Punch up the red wherever you feel like you need to on the shadows of the petals and in between each stripe. This is really building the richness of that flower. Alright, lovely people, that concludes part 2 for this watercolor tutorial. Part 3 is forthcoming, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next part. Also, my door is always open via social media if you have any specific questions. I love talking art with people, so enjoy the rest of your day. Bye!